afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Marzek, Director of the Adrian Arst Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining us today for this incredibly timely conversation on the future of supply chains and commercial cooperation in the Western Hemisphere as we look toward the incoming Biden administration, a conversation that you can follow on Twitter with the hashtag ACTrade. Just a few hours ago, we released a publication which we'll be discussing today, jointly produced between the Atlantic Council and Baker McKenzie, which comes at such a pivotal moment. Supply chains across the hemisphere, and frankly, of course, around the world, are under incredible pressure due to COVID-19, shortages, demand reduction, price swings, and other upheaval. With vaccines now coming online, still, what will be the short-term and long-term impact on supply chains of the pandemic, and how are they being reshaped, and what are the implications for regional competitiveness? Of course, these questions come as today, exactly 6 weeks from now, Joe Biden will take office as president of the United States with an immediate task of navigating the largest economy in the hemisphere out of this complex crisis. With supply chains across the Americas highly impacted by the destabilizing effects of 2020, where do opportunities exist for the United States to work alongside its partners, allies in the Americas, to advance trade integration, modernize and enhance supply chains, and bolster resilience against future disruptions or shocks? These are challenging and trying times for the global community. Latin America and the Caribbean has been one of the regions hardest hit by the pandemic, with 1/3 of global cases and deaths. Given the enormous headwinds being faced today, this afternoon's discussion will explore how the U.S. can partner with the region in its recovery. We will dig deeper into the findings of our newest report in collaboration with Baker McKenzie, titled The Biden-Harris Administration and the Future of Supply Chains in the Americas. In this spotlight publication, 17 authors from various countries, regions, industries, represent the public sector, private sector, tackle 5 key questions on the future of supply chains in the Americas. The report explores how the incoming administration and the Western Hemisphere can capitalize on the opportunities to modernize supply chains and to bolster resilience. I'd like to thank Baker McKenzie for their partnership and the publication released today and in today's event. This is part of work that we've been doing together now for over 5 years that has combined the expertise of the Atlantic Council and the expertise of Baker McKenzie. I'd like to especially thank our 2 Baker McKenzie speakers today who also contributed to the Spotlight publication. Maurice Bellin, who's the managing partner of Baker McKenzie's Washington, D.C. office, and also member of the Global Dispute Resolution and North America Litigation and Government Enforcement Steering Committees. And also Jennifer Truck, a Baker McKenzie partner and chair of the Global Aviation Group and North America International Commercial Practice Group. Maurice, Jennifer, so great to work with you on this and to work with your teams. I'd also like to recognize the other speakers joining us today who contributed to this publication. Chunka Rojas, a former Undersecretary for International Trade in Argentina, Omar Vargas, Global Government Affairs Lead at 3M, and Juan Carlos Baker, a former Undersecretary of Trade for Mexico. I'd also like to thank there are many other authors who contributed to this report who are joining us today. Christina Conlin, Carrie Contini, Reagan Damas, Secretary Ildefonso Fajardo, Landon Loomis, Manuel Padron Castillo, Ann Peddard, Lisa Schroeder, who is also speaking on today's program, Allison Stafford, Joyce Smith, and Carlos Alberto Vela Trevino. Thank you all to everybody for your contribution to this. Look forward to today's program. Now I'm going to hand it over to Sean Donnan, senior writer and reporter from Bloomberg, to guide our first discussion. Sean, over to you.
Thanks, Jason. It's wonderful to be back at the Atlantic Council, although I wish I could be there in person rather than here in my home office / closet. I apologize for the mess behind me already. There's this fascinating thing that's happened in the last 4 years where the once very dull and earnest topic of trade has become this hot, sexy topic, perhaps for some of the wrong reasons. But that's also taken us really into a world where supply chains, which is, again, a topic that is often one for specialists, has really taken that into the world of geopolitics and regional diplomacy, and broader geoeconomics. And that conversation, it's been fascinating to watch how that conversation has evolved also from the days early on in the Trump administration when many of us were trying to figure out if the end of NAFTA was upon us, to the renegotiation of NAFTA and its rebranding as a USMCA, and now to the pandemic, which has brought us to a whole different set of lessons on supply chain. So I think this report is really great. I really have enjoyed reading it. Some really thoughtful contributions in there. It feels like a great oral history that really captures a moment in thinking out there by some very smart people. Jason, we're going to come right back to you in terms to get this conversation started, and I really want you to walk us through what you think this incoming administration, the Biden administration, needs to prioritize first when it comes to trade and supply chains. Let's talk about those first 100 days that we love to talk about here in Washington.
Yeah, Sean, thank you. I'd love to. We always love to talk about those first 100 days. A lot of other priorities for the incoming administration those first 100 days. First and foremost, among those will be USMCA, continued implementation of USMCA coming just online in July. A number of issues still to work through with regard to its full entry, full effectiveness. And given the importance of Mexico, given the importance of Canada for U.S. trade and integration, both being such critical partners, not only U.S. nationally, but at a state level, that's going to be critical. Also starting to ensure that there is continued resilience of supply chains as we move forward. Even with vaccines coming on, there might still be additional disruptions to supply chains. And so how can we ensure that those supply chains are resilient? How can we avoid some of the challenges that occurred back in the spring between the U.S. and Mexico, when there was a lot of questioning insofar as what were industries that were impacted by supply chain challenges, and which industries were should move on despite the pandemic. I think USMCA strong North America supply chains are critical for the U.S. recovery, for Mexico's recovery, and ensuring the resilience of those supply chains moving forward.
So we're back to USMCA and really that reinforcing those important economic relationships there. Maurice, I want to come to you now, because in this publication you did something that was really interesting to me. Is you invoked the U.S. Constitution in a discussion about supply chains in the Americas. And I think the point you were trying to make there was really about the important role that the U.S. has and that the U.S. government has in kind of bring some kind of regional stability. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that? You with us, Maurice?
I think he's muted.
I think you may.
Unmute. Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Host unmuted me, and then I muted myself. Thank you for the question. I do think that the United States has a responsibility, especially as we navigate our way through this global pandemic in the region. I think that we're inextricably linked economically, and as you think about the distribution of a vaccine, if you will, and the supply chains and the challenges of ensuring the integrity of the distribution, protecting that distribution from fraud, which always has a potential within supply chains. The Biden-Harris administration is going to have to engage in a way that the previous administration has not. They're going to have to, restore confidence in several governments throughout the Latin American region, that they will engage proactively. They're going to have to create sort of multi-jurisdictional dialogues for enforcement to ensure that the sort of vaccines that will be distributed throughout the region, will be distributed fairly, evenly, and openly. it's not enough, for us to be focused in the United States on making sure that those within the borders of the United States of America have access to a vaccine. Our borders are open. As much as people may argue that they aren't or shouldn't. And so the flow of people, the flow of commerce requires that we have a holistic approach, to ensuring the integrity of the supply chain, protecting the distribution, and making sure that all persons have access to a vaccine that will keep us all in the region healthy. That has economic value as well as sort of a health and welfare value. And so when it brings it back to the Constitution, as the President of the United States, your primary responsibility is to protect the health and welfare of its citizens. That is a constitutional priority. And to do that, you must ensure that we have solid, productive, economic, and viable relationships with our most trusted partners and neighbors in Latin America.
So to have America first, you need to have America together with its neighbors, is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Jennifer, you in this publication, you write a little bit about, you think through a little bit these kind of global shock events that we're seeing more and more of in the world. The pandemic clearly has been a global event. It has woken us all up to all sorts of different threats. But through the years, we've seen things. I remember the tsunami in the Indian Ocean. When was that? 2004, 2005. You think about the tsunami that hit in Japan in 2011, and the shock that was to global supply chains at the time. But this one's much broader. It's right there in our backyards. It affects our ability to buy flour and toilet paper and all of those things that we need to stay home and bake bread. But it's raised all sorts of other questions about supply chains as well. I mean, where are they when it comes, or how do they fit in terms of efforts to address the environment, social issues, and governments, those kind of ESG goals that we all are starting to think a lot more about. So how should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, no, thanks, Sean. I think that's a great question, and thanks for the opportunity. I think long-term transformation and renewal are going to go hand in glove with delivering on sustainability priorities. So, if we're talking about supply chain disruption and the need to rebuild more nimble and reliable supply chains. But as we do that, companies are also going to be thinking about being focused on longer-term sustainability initiatives when they're reimagining their supply chains, right? And I think what we're going to see is a prioritization of sustainability goals along with some of the other technologies that are being implemented to have a more nimble and efficient and cost-effective supply chain. I think companies are going to be motivated by several factors. Not only is sustainability and ESG priorities the right thing to do, but increasingly ESG benchmarks are being used by governments when companies receive aid. And we know, of course, in a pandemic situation, many companies have been receiving governmental aid with some of those requirements attached. We've seen governments impose those requirements more generally on enterprises as well. And then we see investors who are also looking towards more sustainable enterprises. And I think all of those factors will help motivate companies to build in sustainability to their supply chain. And how they'll do that, I think there'll be a renewed focus on things like digitization, use of AI, robotics, drone technology in my own sector of aviation, and other things like that to add efficiencies and reduce human risk. And then also, as companies will be looking to reduce, consolidate, and relocate their manufacturing capacity, they're likely to be able to consider other factors as they do so on a longer-term basis, including things like climate risk management and social environmental responsibilities. So I think, I really do think that sustainability and supply chain go hand in hand, especially when we're looking at the way that we're reimagining our supply chains in light of recent events.
Just a reminder to those in our audience, and we do have a big audience today, which is great to see, that you can submit a question using the Q&A feature on Zoom down there. And I'm just going to go to one that we've received already, which gets at Maurice, Jennifer, and Jason, if you want to jump in here. I mean, this one of the big questions we're going to have to answer, and it relates to supply chains and how they're going to intersect with the people that we all serve. And that is, there's a lot of people out there still who may resist getting vaccinated. And I wonder, how do you manage that? And this is a question coming from the audience here, from Henry Ullid, and my apologies if I mispronounced your name. Henry asks, how do you think this could be managed in order to avoid the crash between those accepting a vaccine versus those who refuse to accept the vaccine? That's an incredibly prickly issue, but also an incredibly important one. Jennifer, Maurice, Jason, who wants to jump in here?
Yeah, it's a very challenging question, and it starts with restoring respect, for institutions and our government institutions that whose primary function is to protect its citizens. And so how do we sort of undo the sort of wave of sort of populism, the wave of sort of, of distrust that has been fed into society at this critical juncture when we need to distribute a vaccine that is going to protect all of us collectively? That's going to be a challenge for the Biden administration. I think part of it, his previous relationship as liaison when he was with the Obama administration to Latin America, I think will be helpful for his engagement, helpful, to create the image of trust, to create actions that people can identify publicly, that people will have confidence in. I think those things are going to help be steps in the right direction. Those things in and of itself are not going to solve and undo, I think, the challenge, but I think that's the steps that need to be taken to restore confidence in institutions. And we have to be a partner with our partners throughout the Latin America and Caribbean to help them restore confidence within their electorate as well. Again, it's a relationship that is tied to our success and is tied to our ability to pull out of this pandemic.
Go
ahead, Jason.
Pick up on a point, Maurice. You made this point before in your opening as well, which is the role of the incoming administration in creating confidence and also showing partnership with the region. We've been doing a decent amount of work in the Agent Orange Latin America Center on COVID and COVID's implications for the region. Actually just had a report come out last week. And as Maurice is saying, what's going to be fundamental is the U.S. role, U.S. partnership with the region in overcoming some of those supply chain challenges that come with vaccine deployment. There are regulatory barriers. There are sheer logistical barriers in getting vaccines across the hemisphere. So, of course, first and foremost for the incoming administration is getting U.S. population vaccinated, but then at the same time starting to prepare to provide the technical support and expertise to allow for the public and private sectors across the region, pharmaceutical companies and others, to work together to ensure that there is vaccine deployment. The other thing really important, Sean, is illicit trade. As Maurice, you were mentioning this in the outset, that there is much misinformation or disinformation about the vaccine, whether we're talking about the U.S. or in other parts of the world. And so what's going to be critical is the U.S. partnership and working with partner countries around the hemisphere to mitigate and stop from the get-go disinformation and illicit trade that would come together with the vaccine.
Right. So we're getting more great questions coming in from the audience here. So I just want to stick with this topic for a second here. Daniel Rangel asks a pretty important question here. Besides caring about supply chain resilience, should the U.S. government incentivize production capacity of the vaccine in other countries of the region? If so, should a Biden administration support the proposal of some developing countries at the WTO to waive IP rules for pandemic-related goods? This is a great example of where this need for kind of global goods and a social mission kind of intersects with the law.
Very difficult and challenging question. I do think that the Biden administration, has been talking about stepping up and mobilizing private investment throughout the region. How it does that and whether the IP rights would be ultimately waived, I'm not going to opine on that, and I don't know or even think that's likely. But I do think that substantial investment in the region and in private investment in public-private partnerships, mobilizing private investment throughout the region, helping them to improve their supply chain, improving service level agreements, making sure that third-party partners and suppliers are able to step up and meet sort of cybersecurity, infrastructure, and regulatory standards. We have a part that we can play in that. We can develop, comprehensive investment. And I know the administration, is talking about a comprehensive 4-year, $4 billion regional strategy to invest in the region. And some of that discussion is to really tackle from an economic perspective the sort of migration factors from Central America to the US. Certainly the pandemic, the availability of a vaccine and the availability of citizens to get, vaccines that they want for their families and children, that implicates migration. That implicates, folks who are going to want to take their child to another country so they can get access. We can and need to provide that investment in the region, in the countries, so they have confidence that they can stay at home and their families can enjoy health, wealth, and welfare there.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Oh, I was just going to add kind of on the supply chain aspect of it. I mean, I think there is a role for, as Maurice was saying, for kind of that private investment too. And when you think about it, there's so many different aspects to a supply chain and getting a vaccine, particularly a vaccine that needs to be stored and transported at ultra low temperatures. There's all kinds of ports in that supply chain where we're going to need that kind of investment. So you think about the safe and effective shipping containers that can withstand temperatures and be transported safely, both for the people and the vessels. You've got the need for active sensors and to monitor the temperature and track things real time, necessary regulatory hurdles. So there's all of these things that kind of tie together with the things that we've been talking about with supply chain and sustainability, because I think a lot of this technology that we're talking about to transport the vaccine is also another example of using digital transformation or digitization to help with supply chain issues, which in turn promotes sustainability in the process. So it's all I think it's all tied together. It's really hard to pull out just one aspect when we talk about supply chain and delivering a vaccine.
Yeah, we know the levers are sometimes mushier than we'd like them to be when we're dealing with things like that. I just want to, we've only got a couple minutes left. I just want to come back to geopolitics for a second here. And this has popped up in the questions from a couple of questions from the audience here. Jason, I think we need to talk about China. We can't have any panel discussion about trade without talking about China. We know that in the region in Latin America, China has been increasing investment hugely. We know that trade between China and Latin America has increased hugely in the last few years. We know, in fact, that China is the #1 trading partner for a lot of countries in the region. How does a Biden-Harris administration go about countering that and positioning the United States and its relationship with Latin America and convincing those countries that its most important partner in the region is the U.S. and not China?
Sean, that's a great question. I think first where it starts off is a change in approach and a change in approach to the region. An approach to the region that's much more based on cooperation and on partnership. And I think it's also a change in the perspective with regard to China. is rest today is with a with us or without us approach with regard to China. It's about how do we actually work together, because there are actually certain areas, certain investments in the region, certain countries that Chinese trade is vital for those countries' recovery. And I think we have to move away from seeking to punish countries for trading with China to instead incentivizing countries to trade with the United States more. And also recognizing that the US has a lot more to offer countries in the region than just trade and just economic. We have shared values, a shared culture, shared history, shared respect for the rule of law, shared respect for democratic norms. So it's all those other intangibles that are vital for the US partnership with the region when countries are looking at their future. And is their future with China or is their future with the United States? Well, there's a lot of incentive for the United States. And also, I think the US private sector, the U.S. business community, and the U.S. Latino, 16 million Latinos in the United States. There are such deep ties between the United States and between the region and between our business communities. And let's also not forget about the Development Finance Corporation, which came on board officially about a little over a year ago. There's a huge opportunity to expand the remit of the DFC to provide financing for U.S. businesses to invest in a whole host of additional sectors across the region.
I think Jason is exactly right. How you solve the challenge is present a credible alternative. It's not enough to impose sanctions. We have to engage cooperatively and provide alternative options of investment in the region that our partners will be able to take advantage of. And so, again, the $4 billion in potentially an investment that I know that the Biden and Harris administration have been discussing, that potentially they're going to invest in the region, hopefully that will be utilized, to create confidence that we're committed to them. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative that China has, implemented throughout the Latin America and Caribbean, also has its warts and its challenges. And we need to have our own initiative throughout the region that will create confidence in what the United States does and believes in our partner countries in Latin America.
Great. Well, we've got some fantastic questions still coming in on the Q&A. Unfortunately, this set of the program has run out of time. We're going to have to hand over those questions to the next set of panelists, and Roberta Braga from the Atlantic Council, who's going to shepherd the conversation from here on out. Thanks so much for joining us for this first part.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you so much to the first group of panelists. My name is Roberta Braga. I'm Deputy Director for Programs and Outreach here at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center. And I couldn't be happier to be moderating the second panel with 4 of the 17 authors that contributed to the supply chains publication that we launched today. So thank you so much for all of you being here today with us. The second conversation will build on what we just talked about, but dive a little bit more deeply into industry and country perspectives on the future of supply chains in the Americas, and also look at how we can be better using new technologies to modernize and strengthen supply, especially as the previous panel mentioned, as we prepare for a second wave of COVID infections after the holidays, as well as for the dissemination of the expected vaccines into 2021, all of which we know is going to be happening under a new administration here in the US. So before we get started, I just wanted to very quickly introduce our wonderful second panel, starting with Juan Carlos Baker, who is the CEO and founding partner at Ainsley Consultores and former Undersecretary of Foreign Trade of Mexico. In the Ministry of Economy in Mexico, he served as Director General for North America, where he oversaw the successful implementation of NAFTA provisions in Mexico, as Deputy Chief Negotiator for the TPP, and as Undersecretary for Foreign Trade, where he led Mexico's trade agenda during the USMCA negotiations. So welcome, Juan Carlos. Xunco Rojas, co-founder at Kipu Advisors and former Undersecretary of International Trade for Argentina. He's also a non-resident fellow at Harvard's Institute for Global Law and Policy and senior advisor to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's U.S. Argentina Business Council. Welcome, Shunko. Lisa Schroeder, Global Director of Trade and Investment Policy for Dow, where she's responsible for defining and managing the company's entire global trade agenda. She focuses on trade policy and legislation, trade negotiations, investment issues, all incredibly relevant themes for today's discussion. Welcome back, Lisa. And Omar Vargas, who was appointed in 2017 by 3M to lead its global engagement of government officials and public policy stakeholders. Prior to joining 3M, Omar led was senior government official in senior government relations roles with Pepsi and Prexar. He also served as an appointee of President George W. Bush to the U.S. Department of Justice. So two public sector individuals and two private sector individuals here with us today to really round out this conversation. A reminder to everyone that you can put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And for everyone following along online, the hashtag is ACTrade, so feel free to ask your questions there as well. So let's kick off the conversation. Juan Carlos, I did want to start with you. You and Secretary Ildefonso Guajardo kind of tackled your contributions to the paper together, and you noted that a first step for the next U.S. administration will really be to kickstart the U.S.'s own economic recovery, and also to do so with the private sector. You also mentioned that USMCA can serve as a model for modernization of supply chains and the way forward. And so I wanted to ask, how so? How do you see that happening? And what do you see as the most important provisions that need to be enforced to bolster trade and the competitive edge of the region?
Absolutely. Thank you, Roberta, for having us. Thank you, Jason and Adrian, of course, for this fantastic initiative. Our friends at Baker McKenzie, no relationship. But just quickly to dive into the issue, and as we explained in the report, I think that there's no question that the countries in Latin America have a long established relationship with the U.S., Mexico even more so for the geographical proximity, and also because, well, the NAFTA now turned into the USMCA, did precisely that work of developing and creating and linking those supply chains across the region. Certainly, the fact that the economy is going through a very steep recession is going to hit us all, but some countries more than others. And in the case of Mexico, whose GDP goes anywhere between 70 and 75% is related to foreign trade, well, this is clearly a relationship that is based on the flow of goods and services across the border. So the fact that the US is investing so much money right now as we speak, there are talks for another stimulus package in Congress, which could be a substantial amount of money. As that money enters into the system and continues activating the economic activity in the US, that not by itself, but that certainly could be a great element of promotion of foreign trade. Now, taking from that point, going into the USMCA, we are already seeing in the case of Mexico some of those indicators. If we looked at the latest statistics that have been published, we see that, for example, the increase of Mexican exports to the US month to month in areas such as automotive, agriculture, and others are experimenting a double-digit growth. So there is a direct relationship in that sense. What the USMCA can bring forward obviously depends on how it is enforced. And there are some provisions that will be enforced in a few years. But regardless of that, I think that it's no secret that the emphasis of the U.S. administration, regardless of whether that is Trump or Biden, the emphasis of the administration has been on making sure that Mexico fulfills those commitments, especially in labor and environment. And I think that that is also a lesson that other countries in Latin America, especially those.
Juan Carlos, I think you got muted for just a second.
Sorry, I was just about to finish, but I got the message. No, I will just conclude in saying that given this emphasis on labor and environment, I think that other countries in Latin America, especially those who currently have an agreement with the US that dates back a few years, they should pay attention to how that is implemented, because very likely the US administration would like to see the same level of compromises and commitments extended across other countries so as to make sure that there's a level playing field.
I think that's a wonderful point. I mean, definitely the lessons learned aspect of this throughout the region, but also with different regions, is something that we should keep in mind. It's also something that some of our authors discussed in the publication itself, lessons learned from the Middle East and Asia in supply chains. Lisa, I do want to go to you now. You mentioned the importance of the private sector in collaboration with the public sector as a driver of innovation. And as the world really struggles to recover from the shocks of COVID-19, I wondered if you could expand a little bit on how you see the public and private sectors better being able to align to support an integrated policy agenda that really enables growth.
Absolutely, Roberta. And thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this great panel, particularly because we're talking about real areas of opportunity. Kudos on an amazing job with the publication, and it really reinforced some very tangible examples of where we can work together and see real progress as we finish out this year and hopefully go on to a much brighter 2021. When you look at what the private sector has done, even under COVID, there's so many great examples of real innovation, especially in the sustainability space. You've seen the incredible work the pharmaceutical companies have done to fast track a vaccine. The industries like mine, the chemical industry, shifting production so that we can contribute the necessary materials to hand sanitizer and other necessary cleaning equipment, what consumer products companies have done to develop new product lines for PPE. That demonstrates how much we can bring to the table to solve real problems. And we've learned a lot through that process, as we talk about in the report, and as was mentioned in the previous panel. When you think of areas like trade facilitation, it's such a great example where both with best practices and what we learned to make customs more efficient, as well as better using technology. So one of the best outcomes in the new USMCA agreement was just building in digital technologies to customs processing. You've seen the same kind of commitments in the US-Brazil mini deal. These are real opportunities for us to move supply chains more efficiently and more quickly so that we're getting materials, whether it's to help make sure that there's hand sanitizer available in a market, or being able to bring in new technologies, products, and raw materials that can help us solve all the other challenges that we've got, streamline and improve the efficiency of the agricultural value chain for food security, or delivering materials that make more energy efficient building and construction materials that allow us to build more sustainable communities. The private sector can bring this to the table, and working in partnership with the government, and especially across the hemisphere, we can identify what those priorities are, whether it's trade facilitation, regulatory cooperation, building in efficiencies of the system so the public sector is doing what they absolutely need to do, ensuring high standards and strong processes, but also allowing those innovative products to get into market so that we're solving whatever the challenge of the day is. Thanks.
And I know you mentioned some of those issues as well as important in your section of the paper. Thank you so much, Lisa. I wanted to pick up on a point you made about the use of technology and pivot to you, Shunko, on exactly that. You've talked a lot about how, as we as a society strive to strengthen regional supply chains, we can better utilize technologies. And so my question to you is, how can countries in the Americas, also taking lessons learned from other regions, utilize new technologies to facilitate modernization and innovation of supply chains? And what are some particularly important areas for harnessing technologies to modernize supply chains? And I believe you might be on mute.
There you go. Thank you, Roberta. Thank you for the invitation to join you at this panel and to contribute to this publication. I think that the content and the timing couldn't be better. And it's a pleasure to join great colleagues, Lisa, Juan Carlos, and Omar. I think that your question goes right to the heart of the public and policy agenda of the coming years in the region. And I'd like to start by saying that this agenda is fundamentally a public-private agenda. And I completely agree with Lisa. I think that the development and success of this agenda could only be possible through a strong public and private collaboration. I believe that there are basically 4 key areas where governments and companies need to focus on. First, I think there is a need for great investment in expanding, upgrading, and making digital connectivity infrastructure more resilient. I think despite the recent advances in the region, several geographic areas and communities remain unconnected or poorly served. Second, I think that governments and the private sector need to work on developing and adopting common regulatory standards and creating a conducive regulatory ecosystem that enables the deployment of technology, the flourishment of entrepreneurship and innovation. I think that there are 4 key areas within this realm of regulatory cooperation. I think that there are 4 key areas where governments and companies should focus on and work together. One is cybersecurity. Second is data privacy, the interoperability of technologies and platforms, and competition, which is key to remain the region competitive in the global context. And I think that there is a strong regulatory cooperation agenda that is necessary to ensure the free and safe flows of data and technology. Third, I think that it's very important for companies to incorporate the new technologies in their productive processes and services. This is known as, Industry 4.0. But I think it's important to work not only at the firm level, but also along the regional supply chains. And this is critical to increase productivity, to keep up with global advances, and also to adapt effectively to disruptive innovations around the world. And this is a constant change that companies need to address. And when we think about the regional supply chains, I think financial institutions can play a very important role in creating the incentives and the instruments for promoting the adoption of green technologies and ESG-driven transformations across the supply chains. Finally, I think that it's critically important to make the regional supply chains more inclusive. I think that governments, private sector, civil society organizations need to work together and make an extra effort to ensure that the labor force, particularly the unskilled labor, SMEs, micro and small firms, women, and other disadvantaged groups who usually face disproportionate.
I think Shunko may have frozen up. Just a second. Shunko, I think you may be on mute. You froze just for a second.
Hello?
We can hear you. Go on.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was saying that I think we need to make the regional supply chains more inclusive. Mm-hmm. I think that we need to work together to ensure that labor force, particularly the unskilled labor, small and medium-sized enterprises, women, and other disadvantaged groups who usually face disproportionate challenges to join supply chains and adapt to technology changes, acquire the tools, the knowledge, and develop the skills necessary to grasp the benefits of digital transformations.
That's an incredibly important point, Shunko. And Lisa, I'll go to you in a few minutes with a follow-up question about that. But before I do, Omar, I wanted to pass the floor to you because it's something that we experienced this year, obviously, was a dramatic demand spike and also very little supply chain elasticity. And there were a lot of challenges that suppliers faced throughout 2020. We saw some of the consequences of all of that playing out this year, some struggles to adapt, but eventually a lot of resilience. And so I wanted to ask you, what are some key global government best practices for developing a sustainable national stockpile for future emergencies? What are some important lessons that you would say should be kept in mind from other regions in terms of regional supply chain convergence or integration that can really be applied to the Americas, especially to promote economic development?
It's a great question, Roberta, and a lot to unpack there. But before I answer, thank you very much for the opportunity here to be a part of the publication as well as part of this panel. I'm honored to join Juan Carlos and Shunko and Lisa in our discussion here, and I appreciated the prior panel because there's a lot of similarities and flow over to our topic here. Look, in personal protective equipment, just medical sector demand globally went up 40 times, significant spike in demand. And when we look back on the past 12 months now of this global pandemic, and particularly in the Americas region here, we do have a couple of thoughts based off of our interactions with government. First off, and probably for mostly, 3M has long advocated, going back decades now, that stockpiles are important. So you need to have a national stockpile program. You also need to have a stockpile for emergency supplies that can be called upon. Your introduction into the question, Roberta, mentioned elasticity. There's not a lot of elasticity in a market, or probably there could never be enough elasticity in any market when you have the kind of demand spike that we saw worldwide very quickly in late January and early February, and as the virus spread from the east to the west, obviously demand grew even more significantly. So in addition to stockpiles, there are a couple of things that we believe are really important here. First, there has to be regulatory flexibility, and just as Shunko mentioned, a common regulatory framework, or even just within national laws, the ability to allow, like through an emergency use authorization, the opportunity for products to come in from other countries that may not normally be used in a particular geography or previously sanctioned. But it's critical to allow additional supplies to come in order to address the need under that emergency type of situation. Next would be actually law enforcement, customs procedures to be able to monitor for fraud. The amount of fraud and counterfeit activity that has occurred and continues to occur is startling. And it's really critical for government to have the mechanisms in place and the partnerships with suitable suppliers and verified suppliers to be able to meet those needs. Finally, it requires public-private partnerships. And I think we've heard a couple of our panelists talk about this today. The public sector and the private sector need to come together, have coordinated plans and approaches, whether it's in production or distribution. And I think a lot that we have learned in the PPE space, Roberta, that's a final thought, really does apply to vaccines. And there's more that can be done here. When it comes to economic integration, that is truly critical. In the Americas, I think we benefit from a significant amount of economic agreements or trade agreements, regional trading blocks, et cetera. For supply chain shifts, for the supply chain transformation that we're seeing as a result of this pandemic, that integration is truly critical, and not just in terms of the trading goods and services. But take, for example, the shutdowns that occurred during the quarantine policies early on in this pandemic. For country to country, or even province to province or state to state, to have varying rules about what types of businesses close down really does create kinks in the supply chain system. And I think it would be very helpful if they're at a regional level or even at a hemispheric level, there was some planning and coordination around how to ensure that supply chains can work in a situation like this, a pandemic or some type of disaster. How do governments help to leverage purchasing for stockpiles, plan stockpiles, and of course, keep borders open to the supply of PPE. We had more than 80 countries around the world impose some type of an export restriction. That doesn't help. It really does exacerbate the shortage situation. And I applaud those governments that, working with companies like 3M and other types of producers, were able to navigate better policies to ensure that those regions of the world, those geographies that do not have domestic production of PPE, were still able to source it and meet the humanitarian crisis that we faced during this pandemic.
Thank you, Omar. I think incredibly important points. Lisa, I wanted to shift back to you to talk a little bit about expanding operations across borders, and the question of nearshoring also came up in the Q&A. But when it comes to Dow and Dow's priorities, when thinking about reassessing supply chain diversification strategies, can you talk a little bit about how important ESG standards are for companies like yours, and what are some key indicators that these organizations are looking for in deciding where to set or expand operations?
Thanks, Roberta. One of the really critical things to think about, I think, for any kind of company or any industry, and you've really heard it throughout both of these panels, when you think about the environment to operate where you're going to grow and be successful, you've heard a lot about the policy agenda. There's a reason why regulatory cooperation is on every agenda, from the US-Brazil deal to the Pacific Alliance to the Americas Business Dialogue. The same for trade facilitation, digital trade. These are all areas that demonstrate reforms many of the governments in the hemisphere have committed to. And now we need to really make that kind of progress so that the operating environment is efficient, but it's also transparent and certain, which makes any company, whether it's a large multinational or a small mom and pop, capable of competing in the marketplace. I think the two other areas to really think about, and again, we've heard some on the panel today, infrastructure. And that's going to be an area a lot of governments look at and focus, as we come out of the global economic situation of this year, as we move into recovery, there's going to be a lot of efforts to grow and sustain infrastructure. That matters for supply chains. You need to be able to move your product and get to the customer or get to the marketplace, especially when you think about that entire value chain. Chemicals are a part of over 96% of manufacturing of all other products. So the more we can bring innovation to our customers, the more they can bring new, innovative, sustainable products into the marketplace. And the last, to Shunko's point, as he raised before, is speaking to inclusivity, is investing in people. As we grow in these markets, as these economies grow, the workforce needs to grow with. There's such an opportunity to really prioritize, refocus, and build on a lot of great work that already exists, but to focus on skills training and really bringing up, sharing new skills, STEM education, and more with the workforce that allows them to compete as these new opportunities emerge.
I think that's a great point. And, my follow-up, and I know we are running out of time, but my follow-up to you, and I'll actually pose this question, I think, to the others on the panel as well, is about, what should we be considering to position our region, the Americas, as a positive place for partnership and further supply chain growth? And then I would add to that question, we've talked extensively in previous panels, other events as well, about what we can expect from a Biden-Harris administration in regard to the future of supply chains. But also, given your unique insights into key industries, what is one thing that you think the next US administration, along with the private sector, can do in 2021 to prepare supply chains in the Western Hemisphere to really withstand major disruptions, shocks, a second wave of COVID-19, and other similar crises in the future? And I will start with Juan Carlos on this one.
Thank you, Roberta. Thank you to all my friends in the panel for those very insightful comments. I think that perhaps the most important thing that companies need to do right now in the face of what you're asking, Roberta, is to realize that from now on, those elements need to be a critical piece of any planning whatsoever. If we have heard before these concepts of the black swan, or now the green swan, when it is related to environmental disasters, I think that from now on, companies need to be aware that this could happen again. If it's not because of another pandemic, hopefully not, because the consequences, well, first of all, the regrettable sanitary and health consequences and the terrible loss of lives cannot be repaired, but the economic consequences of the pandemic are going to be here far longer. And there are many chances that this could happen again. So the first the first and perhaps the only, so as to leave enough time, recommendation that I would do is to make sure that in addition to the geopolitical risk, to the technology risk, or any of the other elements that companies are naturally more familiar with, now you have to factor this in any planning that you do going forward.
Shunko, what about you? And I think you might be on mute.
Can you hear me now? Sorry, my connection failed for a minute. I missed your question. Can you repeat it, please?
It was just, kind of to leave our audience with a sense of what is one thing, in your opinion, that in 2021, the US administration, along with the private sector, should do to really position supply chains to withstand shocks like the ones we had in 2020
Sure.
or a second wave of COVID in 2021?
So I think that next year we have the Summit of the Americas, and I think that it will provide a unique opportunity for the political leaders of the region, and especially for the Biden-Harris administration to build a constructive and common agenda for the region, where they can discuss and agree upon key guiding principles to set up policies and create incentives to build strong and modern regional supply chains. And I'd like to mention here also something that I think is very, very important. Last week, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy made an invitation, a proposal for the Biden administration to build a new transatlantic agenda for global cooperation. And I think that this agenda that the EU is proposing is basically based on common values, common interests, common history. And I think it's almost natural that the hemispheric agenda is connected to this transatlantic agenda, because we also share these common values, common interests, and common history.
Thank you, Shunko. I might actually pivot to you at the very end, because we do have a related question in the chat about that. Omar, what about you? One key priority for next year?
No, I would encourage the U.S. government, the next administration, to partner and meet with the governments in the hemisphere, just as Shunko had recommended. Find a multilateral platform to plan, as Juan Carlos had recommended, and to discuss and to actually establish agreements regarding the facilitation of trade in a pandemic like this, border crossing, the mechanics of border crossings, all the way to complexities around the trade in various regulated products. I think that is super critical to plan for in anticipation of another pandemic. They will come. There's nothing that we can do about it. We at 3M, we had testified to Congress in 2006 to plan for the next pandemic, and we urge governments around the world to do the same. You inspired us, Roberta. We are developing a white paper at 3M on a complete set of policy recommendations to share, and we'll be issuing this very soon. And thanks to you and the inspiration from this project.
Thank you, Omar, for your contributions to the paper. Lisa, what about you? Why don't you steer us home with this question?
Absolutely. And I want to go back to the environmental agenda, because I feel like that's such a great area of opportunity where, given the interest by governments all across the hemisphere, we can come together. There's a lot of discussion about the broad policy agenda and long-term goals. But what I think is a real area of opportunity is for us to begin to work on, what are the innovations, technologies that exist now that we can do more to deploy and start solving these challenges now, whether it's waste management, clean water, energy efficiency, combating climate change. We've got a lot of innovation across the hemisphere, and bringing that into the marketplace more now will help us reach those long-term goals.
Thank you, Lisa. I realize it's now 3 p.m. I would encourage everyone, I saw my colleague Angela posted in the chat a link to the paper. I would encourage everyone here today to really, read through the 17 authors' perspectives. What we did was we had 3 or 4 people tackle one of 5 questions each. And so it's really an exchange from experts in the Americas about some of these relevant questions. And so I really encourage you to check it out. I want to thank all of our panelists so much for their participation, for their contributions in writing and here during the event. And I also want to thank our partners at Baker McKenzie for really lending their thought leadership to this paper, to this event, and to the conversation on supply chains more globally overall. It's really been a truly collaborative effort. And so thank you all so much for this. And everyone have a great afternoon.